Imagine a country with three presidents, not one, three, rotating in and out of a shared presidency, representing three different ethnic groups, governing a state that is itself divided into two separate entities, each with its own government, its own army, its own police force, and its own political vision for the future. One of those entities has been actively trying to pull away from the country for years. The other is itself split into 10 cantons, each with its own layer of government, and underneath all of it sits an international authority, still present today, with the legal power to override the entire political system if it decides to. This is not a failed state. It is a functioning one, just barely, and the reason it is built this way goes back to one of the worst atrocities in Europe since the Second World War. This is why Bosnia is so complicated. To understand Bosnia, you have to understand Yugoslavia and what happened when it fell apart. Yugoslavia was a multi-ethnic federation created after World War I and rebuilt after World War II under the communist leader Josip Broz Tito. It brought together Slovenes, Croats, Serbs, Bosniaks, Macedonians, Montenegrins, and others under a single state. The official ideology was brotherhood and unity. National identity was acknowledged but deliberately subordinated to the Yugoslav idea. It mostly worked while Tito was alive. He kept the system balanced through a combination of political skill, repression, and economic management. He died in 1980. After his death, the glue began to dissolve. The economy deteriorated sharply through the 1980s. Political power rotated between the republics through a collective presidency, and that system struggled without a strong central figure. Nationalist movements, which had never gone away, began to resurface. Politicians who had once spoken the language of Yugoslav unity started speaking the language of ethnic survival. Bosnia sat at the center of this, geographically and demographically. It was the most mixed republic in the entire federation. Unlike Slovenia, which was overwhelmingly Slovene, or Croatia, which was mostly Croat, Bosnia had no single majority group. In the 1991 census, roughly 44% of its population identified as Bosniak Muslim, 31% as Bosnian Serb, and 17% as Bosnian Croat. These communities were not neatly separated into different regions. They were intermingled across towns, villages, and city neighborhoods that had coexisted for generations. Sarajevo was one of the most ethnically mixed cities in Europe. That mixing, which had been Yugoslavia's pride, became its most dangerous feature when the country began to fracture. When Slovenia and Croatia declared independence in 1991, and when Yugoslavia's violent disintegration began in earnest, Bosnia faced an impossible choice. Staying in a Yugoslavia now dominated by Serbia was unacceptable to Bosniaks and Croats, but leaving meant confronting the question of what Bosnia actually was, and who it belonged to. There was no clean answer, and the people who wanted to exploit that ambiguity were already preparing. Bosnia declared independence in April 1992. The international community recognized it almost immediately. What followed was nearly 4 years of war. The Bosnian Serb leadership, backed by the Yugoslav army and the Serbian government in Belgrade, rejected the new state. Their goal was to carve out a territory connecting Serb majority areas into a contiguous bloc, either to join Serbia directly or to create a separate Serb republic. The political project required controlling land. Controlling land required removing the people who were already living on it. That is where ethnic cleansing entered the picture. What unfolded across Bosnia between 1992 and 1995 was systematic. Towns were surrounded and shelled. Non-Serb populations, primarily Bosniaks, were forced out, imprisoned, or killed. Detention camps were established. Mosques and cultural sites were deliberately destroyed. Communities that had existed for centuries were erased within days. Sarajevo was placed under siege. For nearly 4 years, the longest siege of the capital city in the history of modern warfare. It was surrounded by Bosnian Serb forces positioned in the hills above the city. Snipers fired into civilian areas. Shells fell on markets. The city was systematically strangled. The international community watched with extraordinary hesitation. The United Nations deployed peacekeepers, but under rules of engagement that prevented them from actually stopping the violence. Western governments debated, disagreed, and delayed. There was deep reluctance to intervene in what many characterized as an ancient ethnic conflict, as though the violence were somehow natural and inevitable, rather than organized and directed. The worst single event came in July 1995. Dutch UN peacekeepers were stationed in Srebrenica, a town in eastern Bosnia that had been declared a UN safe area. Bosnian Serb forces under General Ratko Mladic overran it. The Dutch peacekeepers did not stop them. Over several days, approximately 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were systematically executed and buried in mass graves. The International Court of Justice later ruled it a genocide. Srebrenica remains the defining atrocity of the war and a permanent source of political tension in Bosnia today. Because the denial of what happened there is still official policy in parts of the country. NATO finally intervened seriously in the summer of 1995, a combination of the Croatian military offensive, a Bosniak-Croat ground push, and sustained NATO airstrikes that shifted the military balance rapidly. By autumn, all sides were exhausted, and the United States pushed hard for a negotiated end. In November 1995, the warring parties were flown to a U.S. Air Force base in Dayton, Ohio. 21 days later, they had an agreement. The Dayton Agreement ended the war. That was its achievement, and it was a real one. The killing stopped. The siege of Sarajevo ended. Refugees began returning, or trying to. But Dayton also created something deeply unusual. To stop the war, the negotiators had to work with the political reality that existed at the end of the fighting, which meant recognizing, at least in part, the territorial control that had been achieved through ethnic cleansing. Bosnia was kept as a single internationally recognized state, but it was divided internally into two entities. The Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, shared between Bosniaks and Croats, received roughly 51% of the territory. Republika Srpska, the Bosnian Serb entity, received roughly 49%. Each entity has its own president, its own parliament, its own government, its own police. Republika Srpska has, at various points, maintained its own security structures. Both entities share weak central state government with limited powers, foreign policy, customs, a central bank, and a few other functions. Almost everything else is handled at the entity level or lower. On top of that, the Federation is divided into 10 cantons, each with its own government, adding yet another layer to one of the most complex governmental structures in the world. Bosnia, a country of roughly 3 million people, has somewhere in the range of 14 governments depending on how you count. Dayton also created the Office of the High Representative, an international authority appointed by foreign powers with the legal ability to remove officials from office, impose laws, and override decisions made by Bosnia's elected institutions. This position still exists. It has been used many times. A foreign official retains veto power over a supposedly sovereign country's decisions. That is how fragile the post-war arrangement was considered to be. The three-member presidency, one Bosniak, one Serb, one Croat, rotates the chairmanship every 8 months. Decisions require consensus. The system is designed, structurally, to give each group a veto, which means that when groups disagree, and they often do, the system can simply stop functioning. Dayton was designed to stop the war. It was not designed to build a functional state, and that tension has defined the country ever since. Bosnia today is, in many ways, still living inside the logic of 1995. The political system created at Dayton has not evolved significantly. Reform requires consensus between communities whose political leaders have very different visions for the country's future. That consensus is almost never achievable. The Bosniak political position, broadly, is that Bosnia should function as a more unified state, with a stronger central government and full territorial integrity. The Bosnian Croat leadership has periodically pushed for a third entity, or for arrangements that increase Croat political autonomy, and the leadership of Republika Srpska has, particularly in recent years, moved toward an increasingly open secessionist position. Milorad Dodik, the dominant political figure in Republika Srpska for many years, has repeatedly questioned the legitimacy of the Bosnian state, denied the Srebrenica genocide despite the rulings of international courts, and threatened to withdraw Republika Srpska from shared state institutions. He has been sanctioned by the United States and the United Kingdom for actions considered destabilizing. He has continued regardless. The European Union has offered Bosnia a path toward membership, and Bosnia received candidate status in 2022. But EU accession requires governance reforms that the political system has proven almost incapable of delivering. The High Representative has intervened multiple times in recent years to impose electoral rule changes that politicians could not agree on themselves. Meanwhile, the economy has struggled. Bosnia has one of the highest youth unemployment rates in Europe. Immigration has been significant and sustained. Young, educated Bosnians have been leaving in large numbers for years, to Germany, to Austria, to wherever offers better prospects. The country is slowly losing the generation that might otherwise push for change. The wounds of the war are also not simply historical. Mass graves are still being found and identified. The identification of victims from Srebrenica has continued for decades using DNA analysis. Thousands of people are still listed as missing. War crimes trials at the International Tribunal and in domestic courts produce convictions, including life sentences for Mladi and the political leader Radovan Karadzic, but the proceedings also became political battlegrounds, with verdicts disputed along ethnic lines. The shared history of the war cannot be agreed upon. Srebrenica is taught differently in different schools, in different entities, sometimes in different classrooms within the same building. Bosnia has, in some areas, ethnically segregated schools, two schools under one roof, with children of different communities following separate curricula. It is one of the most visible symbols of how deep the division still runs. Bosnia is complicated because it is a country built on a compromise that no one fully accepted, governed by a system designed to prevent war rather than enable progress, and held together by international attention that has been gradually fading. The Dayton Agreement did something remarkable. It stopped one of the most violent conflicts in post-Cold War Europe, but it did so by essentially codifying the division it was supposed to overcome. It gave each community enough to prevent them from returning to war, while giving no one quite enough to build something genuinely shared. What Bosnia illustrates, more clearly than almost anywhere else, is how hard it is to rebuild a political community after mass violence. Trust, once destroyed at that scale, does not return quickly, and political systems that entrench ethnic identity rather than transcend it tend to reproduce the tensions they were designed to contain. Bosnia is not on the edge of collapse today, but it is not moving forward either. It is suspended between the war that made it and the future it has not yet managed to build, and in a part of the world where history has a habit of returning. That suspension is not something the rest of Europe can afford to ignore indefinitely.